On August 6, 1965, U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law, granting African Americans the right to vote promised by the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution. It was made permanent by the federal government and has been revised 5 times. The 15th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified in 1870. It stipulates that a citizen's right to vote shall not be revoked on the basis of race. As a result, African American involvement and representation in the Southern states increased significantly. Following the Civil War, the federal government oversaw the Reconstruction era in the Southern states. When the Compromise of 1877 came to an end, the Southern states resorted to Jim Crow laws. The term Jim Crow was coined by an African American character in an 1832 ballad. It quickly became known as the Jim Crow Statute or segregation law. The statute was intended to separate African Americans, colored or blacks, from white Americans in many spheres of society. In Alabama, the infamous Jim Crow statute allowed for separate waiting spaces, ticketing booths, and bus seats for African Americans. In addition, schools in Florida were segregated. Burial grounds for blacks and whites were not the same in Georgia. Finally, prison wardens made certain that white criminals' quarters and eating places were kept apart from black convicts. White supremacists continued to intimidate and harass African Americans in order to keep them from voting, using poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and literacy tests. African Americans began to battle against segregation in the early 1900s, but it wasn't until 1954 that their voices were heard by many, and change began to take effect. The Civil Rights Act was passed on July 2, 1964, as a result of a chain of events that included the Brown v. Board of Education case, the Montgomery bus boycott, the Birmingham campaign, and the March on Washington. Unfortunately, the bill ignored difficulties with voting rights and instead concentrated on segregation and employment discrimination. The 24th Amendment, which forbade the collection of poll taxes in order to exercise the right to vote, was ratified on January 23, 1964. Laws were passed, but white supremacists still attacked African Americans. Alabama stated that there was a lot of violent opposition to black people voting in Selma. As a response, civil rights activists like John Lewis and Martin Luther King Jr. organized the Selma marches to protest problems with black voting. President Lyndon B. Johnson encouraged Congress to remove provisions relating to race-based voting from the Voting Rights Act when he sent it to them on March 25, 1965. The Voting Rights Act, usually known as the VRA, was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson on June 6, 1965, outlawing all forms of voting discrimination. Additionally, it made all forms of racial discrimination illegal. The 17 sections that made up the VRA were split into 2 categories: general provisions and special provisions. The mission was to submit reports on the voting changes from the southern states that used literacy exams, specifically Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, Louisiana, and South Carolina. Additionally, they were forbidden from enforcing any type of procedure that might restrict someone's ability to vote due to their race or skin tone. Voting reforms were implemented for the first time by the federal government because it had hitherto been a state issue. Additionally, it was prohibited by law to coerce or intimidate someone who was trying to cast a ballot. The 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution secured the VRA of 1965. It has been altered 5 times in the past, in 1970, 1975, 1982, 1992, and 2006. African American voting participation in Mississippi increased from 6% to 59% in 1969. By 1975, the law's provisions were also applicable to other American minorities, including American Indians, Asian Americans, and those with Spanish ancestry. Illiterate and disabled individuals were given aid with voting in 1982.